Welcome to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast, all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host, Sarah Schaefer from the Yale School of Medicine, and today, as part of the Promotional Development Series, we will be discussing building your promotional packet in academics. Our guests today are Emily Gilmore, Associate Professor of Neurology and member of the Faculty Mentorship Committee at Yale, and Sarita Spudic, Gilbert H. Glasser Professor of Neurology and Division Chief of Neurological Infections and Global Neurology, also at Yale. Thank you for being with us today, both of you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Sarah.
So I want to start with just the basics, and I do understand that this may differ institution to institution, but Emily, would you mind describing some of the basic tracks that somebody might be on at an academic institution?
Yeah, sure. I can speak a bit to Yale's infrastructure, and I think this is a theme that's emerging across academic institutions, which is, having clinical or clinician tracks, and then having research tracks. And that research might be broad and bin you into a clinician educator track in which you're doing education-related research or education-related curriculum development, right? Or you're doing clinical trials or clinical research that touches on, patients in the population that you're specializing in, right? And then I think within that, there's also the clinician scientist track who could be doing more translational work or also building further along the clinical trials pathway, but instead of being a PI for someone else's trial, you might actually be the one who's leading the trial nationally, right? And so some of these things have to do with the scientific rigor with which you approach things and the involvement that you have. And then there's a more traditional track, or what's the term, the tenure track, right? And that's really for folks who are in the scientific realm doing bench-related research often that separates them from, say, the clinician educator or clinician scientist track. And so those are I think the main tracks that institutions usually have outlined. And you don't need to declare that track right away, right? But depending on how you're recruited and hired, you may be kind of binned into one of those tracks to begin with. And then depending on what successes you have, you might end up transitioning between different tracks at different time points in your promotional process.
Anything to add to that, Sarita?
No, I think that summary is excellent. I think the only thing I'd say is that, as just as Emily said, this can be different at different institutions. The sort of names for these tracks and even sort of how they're defined can be slightly different at different places. And the other thing is that between sort of here at Yale, for example, there's a clinician scientist and traditional track, as Emily just said. And, some of the people who are in the clinician scientist track actually do basic benchtop work, but they've decided to sort of have that be, a little bit more the focus in the clinician scientist. Maybe they do stuff that's a little bit more clinically oriented. And there are occasionally people who are doing clinical research or translational research that isn't necessarily 100% at the bench who do end up in the traditional track. So to some extent, the actual definitions of these can be sort of up to the individual department and sort of getting the right type of support behind you to really figure out which path.
Okay, that's a great summary. And to talk a little bit more about the language of this or the terminology, can you describe, Sarita, maybe you could describe the difference in the actual academic positions like instructor, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor? What are the differences in, obviously there's a difference in name. Are there differences in things like protected time, salary, sabbatical, other things? Obviously, knowing that this also could differ between institutions.
So this is again, a different sort of set of steps that actually define these different academic positions, may be slightly true at different institutions. But overall, an instructor position is often a sort of starting position for someone who maybe is coming right out of clinical training, coming right out of a fellowship, has maybe a maybe 1 or 2 year type appointment where they're trying to figure out whether staying at that institution is the right fit for them, and also the institution may be trying to decide whether it's the right kind of thing and which pathway this individual would undertake afterwards. The assistant professor position is really a starting position that's intended to be the beginning of a longer term trajectory at an institution. And so someone typically comes in at that stage and starts to negotiate sort of long-term questions, such as, in the first few years that I'm here at this institution, how am I going to be spending my time? Am I going to be mostly seeing patients? Am I going to be doing some research? Will I be expected to get some grants, or will I be getting support from the institution to do the work that I want to do? And the criteria for getting an assistant professor position also really depends on which track one is entering. So entering into a more clinical path really will then depend on your clinical excellence and what you've done clinically in terms of your training, versus a track where you maybe have research responsibilities or research expectations. You may have had to have some track record of publications or getting grants and that kind of thing to start in this path. Understanding sort of what it takes at the next levels relates again to the criteria in your particular track. So if you're somebody who's primarily a clinician, getting promoted to associate professor involves things like demonstration of clinical excellence, demonstration of having some reputation outside of your institution. Maybe you're somebody that other local doctors will refer you to patients to see you specifically. And also potentially having a reputation for being on some kind of clinical guidelines committees or something else that's primarily clinical. The criteria, if you're on a research type path, does relate to getting more of a national reputation for your research. Or if you're on an educational path, for getting a national reputation for your educational efforts. So for example, creating a curriculum that other people are using at other places, or writing really important guidelines or reviews that other people are using. And for most institutions, full professor is associated with getting more of an international reputation, so that people from other places around the world even would turn to you or read your papers or invite you to give talks, or even think of you as a master clinician, where people in other places would seek to read your reviews or hear about your thoughts in taking care of patients.
Yeah, I've heard it summarized as assistant professor is local reputation, associate is national, and full is international reputation, just as a rule of thumb. Sounds like that's what you're describing.
Yes, exactly.
And what about the second part of the question in terms of what additional perks there might be after promotion? Why even worry about getting promoted?
Yeah, again, the perks differ depending on exactly which perk you're talking about and which path you're in. I mean, I would say that one of the major perks of promotion is increased salary. And so certainly as you go through, the expectation is that almost every institution, as you go from one level to another, there would be an increase in your amount of your compensation for your level of expertise and what you're contributing to the institution. And this can be, at some institutions, there's a big jump between these different levels. At some institutions, there's a really small jump between these different levels. Some other perks, such as protected time, really don't relate to your level of, in this academic ladder. Protected time really relates to whether or not there are other activities where you're contributing to the department, where the department feels that that time needs to be compensated. So for example, if you become a program director or you become somebody who's really involved in some kind of leadership in the department, you may have more protected time where you get salary compensation for those kinds of efforts. That also really differs between institutions. But that's not really directly linked to the promotion at the different faculty levels. And some institutions, such as Yale, really, really has a wonderful perk of something which is considered sabbatical, where you can actually take time away from your regular clinical or other local responsibilities at the institution and take time away to pursue some other kind of educational, scholarly, clinical type of work. And here at Yale, that sabbatical is available to people once they become associate professor and above. I'll tell you that most medical schools do not offer sabbatical. So this is a unique thing here at our institution. Many, many other institutions don't have sabbatical for people in medical school faculty.
So the other thing I would just add, all of that's great, but the instructor position might also be used for someone who doesn't want their research clock to start. And I don't know, Serena, if you want to comment on that, but the idea of establishing the research program and not having that count towards the time gap you have to get your grant within, meaning like for a K awardee, that's typically 6 years, and that clock doesn't start until you become an assistant professor. And so sometimes people will use that instructor time to really establish the preliminary data they need to ensure the success of that timeline. Is that anything you want to add to that?
Emily, I think that's an outstanding point. And we often think sort of, oh, I want to jump to being an assistant professor right away. Why wouldn't I? But that's an absolutely good reason that some people do hold off for a year or two, because it gives them a little bit of time to, as you say, get established before whatever clock it is that starts ticking. Because some institutions do have clocks by, if you're not promoted by a certain number of years from assistant to associate, you may have to switch to a different track or even leave the institution. So you're absolutely right. That instructor position, there are some potential benefits in slowing things down just a little bit if you want to.
That's a really good point. Well, that actually segues really well into a later question on the timeline for promotion. So why don't we dive into that? What is the timeline for promotion? How soon after somebody starts at an institution does this even get considered? You were talking about the clock. I'm sure it's different institution to institution and track to track, but in general.
Sure. So, that again, it does differ institution to institution, but for most places, within the first 3 years of your appointment as assistant professor, you really do have some room to grow and room to figure out exactly what your trajectory might be. There really is an imperative to start trying to be excellent from the beginning and really trying to be productive in whatever arena you're most excited about, whether that's clinical or whether that's developing a research program or getting involved in education. But usually within the first 3 years or so, one has some time to sort of spread one's wings and find one's way. In the following 3 years, so within the first 6 years, most institutions really want their faculty to have a real growth trajectory, because usually associate professor considerations start at 6 years in most institutions. So some institutions it's 5 years. For some institutions, there's a little extra time, particularly if you have things like family responsibilities or caregiving responsibilities or other reasons that it may take an extra year or two to get to the next level. But typically what we have seen here, and which is true in a lot of institutions, by about your 4th year, you should start to be thinking about whether or not you're kind of building your CV in such a way that you could be coming up for associate professor in the next 2 or 3 years. And then for a lot of institutions, people spend 6 to 7 years at associate professor before they go up for full professor. For some institutions, including Yale, there can be multiple cycles at associate professor. So one can spend 6 to 12 years actually as associate professor until you go up for full professor. But again, that's variable, and there are some places where it's a shorter timeline. And occasionally you can also accelerate these processes and ask to be promoted earlier.
Anything to add to that, Emily?
No, I think that sums it up. Yeah, I don't think it's ever too early to start thinking about it, though, once you've joined the program, because the time passes so quickly.
And Serena, you mentioned terms, these 3-year terms. What is the difference between a term renewal and consideration for promotion? Do those happen simultaneously? Are they separate processes?
Those are very institution specific. So some institutions have sort of automatic, you've been in this level, either assistant professor, associate professor, and we'd like to just, automatically have you go up for the same thing for another period of time, whether it's 3 to 6 years. And then there's some institutions where there's nothing automatic, there's no term renewal. You simply have to be considered for promotion at an end of a defined period. So let's say 6 years, you automatically have to go up for the next stage. But the term renewal is actually something which is pretty specific, I think, to our institution, where some people just automatically will go up for the same position unless you're asking to be moved forward.
Okay. And we don't have to talk about this too much, but I just wanted to bring up the word tenure, which I think, Emily, you mentioned earlier as a somewhat separate process or issue compared to promotion and term renewal. Can you just talk a little bit about what that is?
Sure. So, I think tenure really usually aligns with that more traditional track, or what had been termed the up and out track, which is what Serena alluded to, having to hit these thresholds of being associate professor by year 6 and full professor by year 10, as an example per se, right? And those tracks, I think, have a bit more history in having faculty stay on for decades at institutions. And not that I don't think institutions want to support that now, but I think because there is a lot of flexibility and movement amongst institutions as academic places have continued to grow and grow, the need for tenure track positions, and perhaps maybe their expense, right? Because it guarantees you, I think, a salary indefinitely, have become less desirable per se, or less necessary even. And so most of the tracks that we talked about outside of the traditional track are considered ladder tracks, meaning tracks in which you move from an instructor to an assistant, or you start at assistant and go to associate up to full professor. But the tenure track is this unique track in which the person is essentially on faculty indefinitely unless they're fired.
Yeah, I would just say that I think for most medical schools, for clinicians, there are very few options for tenure. And even for people who are primarily investigators, tenure doesn't really guarantee your full salary, for example. The tenure would guarantee some portion of your salary that's considered the sort of minimal portion of it. But really, tenure is something that we think of as being part of more of a sort of undergraduate type of professor position, where somebody in history or something gets tenure and has a guaranteed salary. Most medical schools don't really offer tenure for medical school faculty, because really your research is not supported by the support, right? And your salary that is supported is only a small proportion of your take-home salary.
So there would still be the expectation that the remainder of your salary would be grant supported.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, Emily, would you mind going through the actual process of promotion? What are these steps?
Okay, so I think it, again, is a little bit variable probably at each institution, but often what happens is, around the middle of your second term at Yale, which is about the 4.5-year mark, knowing that you're up for a term renewal versus promotion at year 6, right? You would meet with your mentors and your division chief in anticipation of trying to understand, are you ready for going up for promotion, or should you pursue another term renewal, right? And so it sounds like a long time in advance, but it takes a while to put all of that work together, which is compiling several documents. At Yale, and so again, this might be somewhat unique. There are 2 CV parts, CV Part 1 and CV Part 2, which is referred to as the supplement. And I would say, I can't stress this enough for all, regardless of where you're at in your career, starting that CV, that traditional piece, Part 1, which is, the typical CV that has your education, career and academic appointments, administrative positions, board certifications, professional honors recognition, grants, invited speaker and presentations, peer review, articles, etc. Right? That piece you can start on day 1 of your first job, and maintaining that will make this process easier. So you've hopefully been keeping up with your CV Part 1, and then you have to put together this Part 2, which really is a way for you and those who support you to advocate for your promotion. Because in that Part 2, you're going to highlight your unique contributions in detail that can't fully be captured in your CV Part 1. And you're going to develop a streamlined narrative around those things. And this could be an overview of responsibilities and contributions to the institution and community. a narrative of clinical and education and scholarly related activities. And then you'll provide some, data around your percent effort, your clinical activities and educational activities, and where you spend all of your time, right? And those educational activities could include your teaching, right, as well as your evaluations and the mentoring that you're doing. You want to really focus on things that can emphasize why you are unique and what you're adding to the institution, and carving out that niche that makes you so valuable. You want to avoid, duplicative text and data, and you want to emphasize that only the most applicable information should be included. So you don't want to ramble, right? You want to get to the point because you don't want to lose people's interest. So you would put those things together, and you would then have it reviewed by your mentors. That would then go to the local, if your mentors and division chief and chair agree, would go to the departmental committee for review. And the committee would review that, and that committee's composed of the senior faculty in the department. And they would review that and decide, based on their review, do they also agree that you're a candidate for promotion, or you need to do X, Y, and Z, and we're just going to move forward with the reappointment. I would say it behooves you to prep usually your faculty mentor. It could be your division chief or one of the faculty that you work closely with research-wise, or from a education or curriculum development standpoint. It's good to prep them for that meeting and tell them some things that they really should focus on or highlight. And then based on that review, right, the department will decide, hey, this person's ready to go to the university committee for promotion, okay? And as part of that process, right, it would go to the university committee, and then you would be asked to come up with a list of people you want to write letters of support for you. And these will be both arm's length and non-arm's length writers. So arm's length meaning folks that, are external to your work. They might be people you've interacted with, but not that you work closely with, but who could speak to your character and your skills and your importance in the field with an objective and impartial nature, right? And they want to, highlight your accomplishments. And although they could be on a consortium or something you've been involved with, they can't be someone you've had really direct engagement or mentorship with. Whereas a non-arm's length letter writer would be someone who has direct knowledge, right, of your skills and activities, right? And so it could be a collaborator or an intramural colleague, but they shouldn't really be faculty from the same department. So they could be institutional, but not necessarily within your division or department. And they have to be the rank above you. They can't be same rank. And so then you would solicit those letters, and assuming the university committee agrees and those letters come back favorably, right, then you would be approved for promotion. And that process, like I said, can really take, about 18 months.
Yeah, wow, what a process. So I wanted to clarify the arm's length. This is a concept that's been very strange to me. The arm's length letters, those are people that you might not know at all. Is that correct? And the committee sends out your information, including your CV, to them, and they use that as impartial information to make a recommendation for or against your promotion, correct?
Correct. So you would help create what's called a referee list, right? And on that list, you would have both the arm's length folks, as you mentioned, right? People that you've not worked directly with. They could be people whose names because you've been involved in multi-center trials with them or consortiums, but you've not had direct engagement. And they could also be, as you said, somebody you've never even talked to in your life. And then, so you would put that list together, and then the committee would decide who to send those letters out to. And you do need a particular number in each of those two groups, the arm's length and the non-arm's length. Usually it's 3 to 5 or 6, depending on the path that you're in and the level of promotion you're pursuing.
Do you have anything to add to all that information that Emily just said?
Well, she just gave you a wealth of information, which is really fantastic. I would say a couple of just pearls. I think one thing is that, keeping one's CV updated in real time makes this much, much easier over years and years of having a faculty position. And years ago, someone gave me the advice to put my CV on my desktop. I don't actually keep it on my desktop anymore, but put your CV somewhere that every time you do anything that would actually be CV worthy, whether it's agreeing to give a lecture somewhere or agreeing to a teaching situation or having some new type of accolade that you could record on your CV, try and open up your CV just at that time and add it. Because otherwise what happens is that, once every 3 years you're up for promotion and you're trying to scramble to remember everything you've done, invariably you will forget things. And you really want to keep track of that in real time. It makes it much easier in the long term. And the only other thing that I would say is that the process does take a long time, and the letter writing part of it can be quite challenging, particularly for people who are primary clinicians and they don't necessarily have lots of contacts throughout the country that might be able to, for example, comment on their national reputation when they're up for associate professor. And so it's helpful if one does get involved in some type of foundation work or getting involved in meetings. It's helpful to just kind of keep track in your mind of people that you might have interacted with, where you had a nice interaction, even if it was just in passing or very brief, because sometimes those people turn out to be great letter writers for you. And the final thing I'll say is that typically in a department that's in the School of Medicine, the promotion will be approved by the department, and then letters will be requested. And then eventually the promotion packet makes it to the School of Medicine Promotion Committee. And that School of Medicine Promotion Committee really does most of the hard work in discussing and determining whether or not this should be then proposed to the main institution or the university. And typically the university would then just take their opinion and go ahead and approve it if they've been approved at that level.
And I know, Serena, that you're on that committee. Who are the people on this committee, and what do you think is the most important thing for the candidate to try to convey to that committee for promotion?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing is that the committees for the medical school promotions, for example, I'm on the one for promotion to associate professor at Yale. It's quite diverse. It has representation from many different departments at the Yale School of Medicine. And it also has representation from some people who are primarily clinicians and others who are primarily researchers and educators and sort of everything along that spectrum, which is really important because, of course, you want people who are able to understand and appreciate the types of barriers and accomplishments and those kinds of things each of these different arenas, really need. I will say that everyone on the committee here at Yale in the School of Medicine Promotion Committee will be a full professor. So they will be at least a full professor, deciding on the promotion between assistant to associate and then associate to full professor. And in terms of what's important to convey to the committee, really what it is making it clear what the contribution is that you give to your university or your school. And so again, if you're somebody who's primarily a clinician, really being able to document in your CV materials and in your promotion packet what it is that you have done, what you've brought to the university, what kinds of things you're most proud of that you've accomplished. And there's no, for example, minimum number of papers or minimum, types of grants or those kinds of things that are kind of absolute criteria for everyone. But really what it is showing that in the arena and in the pathway that you have chosen, how successful you have been and why it is that you really merit consideration for moving up to the next level.
Emily, can you talk about where you think someone might go wrong in the process?
I think there's a couple things that probably come to mind in thinking through, having talked with some faculty or thinking about the process and sitting on the committee. And I think one is not doing the work, right? Not realizing that, depending on which domain you fit in, that it is actually going to be work, that actually nothing gets given to you without that, right? And so you do need to establish your importance and what you bring to the institution, as Serena mentioned in her last comment, and why you're unique and important and invaluable, right? And so you've got to do the work, and that means sometimes putting yourself out there and doing some things that are outside your comfort zone, right? Not everyone loves talking at local and national meetings. Not everyone loves giving lectures, right, to trainees. And so figuring out those things that need to be done, not just to check the box, but to make sure that you are presenting the whole picture of what an academic institution looks at, right? And again, some of that's going to be dictated by the track that you're on, but in each realm it can be applied, right? In each track it can be applied. So if you're a clinician, it means getting involved on a national level with committee work and guidelines, and getting out there and getting recognized. For the clinician educator, it might mean some of the curricular development stuff or national society stuff related to program development and building a program, or adding to the curriculum, as we've talked to, and in the scientist path, getting grants and doing the research and publishing, and being a part of research related activities on a national level through committee work as well. So I think that is really important. You've got to do the work. I think the other piece to that is, if you've done the work or you're doing the work, not being shy about promoting yourself, right? Or taking that proactive approach. Writing that second CV is awkward, because you have to really talk yourself up. And that's not something I think most of us feel super comfortable doing all the time, right? This mentality of, if I do the work, it will be noticed and rewarded. They'll see my value and worth. Well, actually, when, depending on the size of your department, no, you've really got to actually show and convey that, right? And then I think the other piece is, not having open dialogue, communicating, understanding what the metrics are, so that you can ensure that you're on track to achieve them, right? And so what the expectations are, and you're not disappointed when someone tells you late that you haven't met them. So I think those are some of the key things that I would highlight.
Yeah, on our podcast episode about cover letters, one of the things that was recommended by one of the interviewees was to have somebody or multiple other people look at your cover letter, not just for grammatical errors and things like that, but also to say, hey, you're not promoting yourself enough here. You're actually really amazing, and you should highlight this, this, and this. And it sounds like that might be a good thing to recommend at this stage as well.
Absolutely.
And so tell me, unfortunately, not everybody gets promoted every time. So what actually happens if you're not accepted for promotion? Is there a disadvantage to trying and failing? Or can you reapply right away? Or do you have to wait a certain period of time? Or what are the consequences?
So I think one of the nice things about having the department review and the department leadership, promotions committee, comprised of people who are very familiar with the process and what the metrics are and what it takes, right? Their review of your application, it is going to hopefully prevent you from not getting promoted if you thought you were, right? Like, so they'll be the stopgap. They'll say, you're not quite ready. These are some of the things you need to do, but this is the path for the next cycle, right, of you being able to be put up for promotion. And so having that, because it doesn't look good upon the department for them to put up somebody who the university says no to. So they really want to put up people that are ready and that are more of a sure thing. I don't think there's any harm per se if the department says, hey, you're not quite ready. I hear you. You're at year 6. You really want to be promoted. But I think if you do X, Y, and Z in the next year, you're going to be totally set. Let's focus that next year on doing those things. So when we put you up next year, there's no question, right? And so that's how I would look at it, more as a iterative process than a binary process of like good and bad. It's a work in progress. And I think ensuring that you have a department that helps support that process is really important, right? I think the other piece to it is it really comes down to how you as an individual define success. Is promotion part of your definition of success? It might be an external metric, but is it an internal one? And so if you look at institutions across the country, including several big name ones, you'll see, quote, senior faculty, meaning people who've been on faculty for years in age, right? Who are still assistant professors. And some of that may be due to archaic infrastructural metrics that they just chose not to achieve, right? checking all those boxes to some degree that I mentioned, hopefully with some passion, not just to check the box. And some of it may have to do, as I alluded to, with that individual's priorities and goals, right? If that's not your definition of success, but you're an assistant professor knocking it out of the park in what you do every day from your perspective, maybe in your contributing locally within the institution, but you haven't really extended yourself outside of that, maybe that's still very valuable both for you and for the institution.
That's such an important perspective. I've personally talked to multiple people who have shifted their priorities after a few years on faculty and, for whatever reason, decided that the fast track to promotion as quickly as possible in an academic institution is actually not their number one priority. So that's an important alternative to keep in mind for sure.
Yeah, I think coupled with that, though, is if you're doing the quote work, right, and you're putting that's regionally and nationally recognized, you do want to get the recognition for it. But that's somebody's definition of what they find valuable and meaningful and right success. And so everyone doesn't fit into the same box. And I think this is in part why the clinical tracks have emerged, right, is to allow people who are making significant clinical contributions have a pathway without a timeline per se of continued success within an academic model.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us about this and giving us all your words of wisdom. Is there anything else you want to add that you think would be good for our listeners to hear?
Yeah. So I would just say, I think, this can feel daunting and overwhelming when you first start. And I think one of the biggest things that you should recognize is that we all go through this and we all have similar feelings. They might be to varying degrees, right? About how scary the process actually is and how much angst it causes, right? So don't be afraid to reach out to people a year or two ahead of you, or even 5 or 6 years ahead of you, just to understand their perspective and hear the process from their viewpoint. And recognize that asking a lot of people is going to give you a lot of perspectives and let you realize that within the framework, there is some heterogeneity for you to kind of figure things out, for yourself. Some easy places to go, depending on where you are, the faculty handbook, the Office of Academic Professional Development. There are often departmental resources and educational sessions that are put on both inter and intra-departmentally. So look for those emails and flyers announcing certain career development type activities. Seek out mentors, and that's multiple mentors, as well as sponsors and coaches, right? Those are all different people with different roles in your lives. And don't be afraid to reach out even inside your institution to solicit input and support. I think in general, I get emails from people not infrequently, not at Yale, who just say, hey, I'd love to pick your brain about how you ended up where you are and what you did to get there. And so in closing, I would just say, be your own best advocate. In whatever path you choose, be excellent and fearless, right? And if it's meaningful to you, be visible.
Such amazing advice, and a good piece of advice not to ignore all those emails that you get from your institution that might be easy to just delete.
Yeah. Sometimes there's some nuggets of gold in there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. This podcast is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. The podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of the individual participants. Music by Audrey Nath, artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast on all available platforms. To hear more about constructing your career in neurology, follow us on Twitter at Neurobolts to stay up to date on new content and give us feedback on what you want to hear, and tell your friends. Thanks for joining us.